Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from trade and tariffs to the OECD's latest developments. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. PwC's Pillar 2 engine, powered by Beacon, is a game changer for Pillar 2 compliance, provision, and modeling calculations. Built on a graph system utilizing over 20 years of international tax technology, this cloud-based centralized rules engine is developed by a team of Pillar 2 tax experts from around the globe. PwC's Pillar 2 engine is currently available as a service and is also available to license. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're in Prague, Czechia, at PwC's Global Transfer Pricing, Customs, and Indirect Tax Conference, where I'm excited to have Chris Desmond back on the podcast. Chris is a principal in PwC's Custom and Trade practice, where he leads PwC US's Global Trade Services offering. Chris, welcome back to the podcast.
It is great to be back, Doug.
So we're recording this in October, and I feel like anytime you and I are talking about trade and tariffs, we need to sort of date this thing because stuff can be out of date very quickly. It's mid-October.
Yep.
But besides being a very dynamic time for trade and tariffs, October is baseball playoff season.
That's right.
It is October. And Chris, I know you're a huge fan of the Chicago Cubs baseball team.
True.
Who are the arch rivals to my St. Louis Cardinals.
Also true.
My Cardinals did not make the playoffs this year.
True.
And finished with their second losing record in 3 years. It's like the first time that's happened in like 3 decades.
I can't believe this.
So I have a question for you.
Oh, okay.
If you had the choice,
Uh-huh.
would you accept your fate losing in the decisive game to the Brewers, or would you have preferred to have been swept by the Dodgers?
That's a great question because this has been coming up for all of my Milwaukee Brewer fans out there who taunted me throughout that whole series. And then after games 3 and 4, nothing, radio silent, because they were scared about that home game, whether or not we were going to win. And of course, they ended up winning. They were the better team this year. I will agree to that. Being swept by the Dodgers, that's got to be tough because it's happened so many times to them. For me as a Cubs fan, I'm just happy for every additional playoff game you can have in October. I'm just happy we made the playoffs.
Exactly.
And that's
and
to
made
me,
it to the division.
That to me is like, we're playing with house money as a wild card team coming in. And the fact that we got to play, we won our first series against the Padres, and we had the opportunity to.
Good Padres team.
They were really good, and we got some experience. I mean, you can appreciate that. As a Cardinals fan, all those years, you guys have so much experience, so many championships, and you crave for that in any organization because if you don't have experience, it's more difficult to go further on, oftentimes. Dodgers have a lot of experience, and they're just creaming these different teams, and they just went through the,
It was
Brewers.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
I will note for the international listeners that have no interest in this baseball talk that we have, that the last series where the Dodgers swept the Brewers in that last game was by Shohei Ohtani, the Japanese phenom, was the single greatest performance in the history
ever
of baseball.
10 strikeouts?
10 strikeouts.
3 home runs?
6 2/3 inning, 3 home runs. Either one of those would be put in the conversation, but the fact that the same guy did both, it really is and they've been keeping statistics for like 160 years.
That's regular season and playoffs combined. The fact that it happened in the playoffs in a pennant clinching game.
Unbelievable. Very exciting.
I just hope we have baseball in a couple years.
Yeah, with the collective bargaining.
Because if the Dodgers go through and they end up winning the World Series decisively, that may really have teams focusing on collective bargaining direction that will perhaps postpone baseball for a season.
They need to do something to level the playing field, so to speak. So, all right, well, we're going to move on because I would love to just do a baseball podcast, but I'm pretty certain, particularly our international listeners, and frankly, even most of our U.S. listeners do not want to hear us drone on about baseball.
Yeah, they probably are tuned out now. Sorry about that.
All right, so let's get into tariffs. And maybe before we dive in, we've got a Supreme Court case. We're seeing a big focus of the Trump administration in the U.S. on these now Section 232 tariffs and some of the 301 tariffs, given this pending Supreme Court case. A lot of companies, I think, are now looking at what they can do to potentially mitigate some of these. But maybe we just start, where are we today, particularly on U.S. tariffs, and how is that impacting the global tariff and trade environment?
Great question, because when we last spoke, companies were just trying to reel from the uncertainty. We've had a tremendous amount of uncertainty. In fact, at the last transfer pricing conference we were at a year ago, who knew that the word tariffs were going to be main stage for the entire year as much as it has on the global stage? This has consumed the news, consumed companies. The impact to the bottom line has been huge. And companies have really, from the start of the calendar year, have had a lot of hesitation to do anything because you didn't know what was going to happen. The tariffs kept on changing. Which country, which rate, which deal is going to be done? Oh, we have a deal. Maybe we don't have a deal. However, now that we sit in October, we do have some trade deals that have been done. UK, EU, some other countries. But we also have some other certainty that's happened around tax reform. So OB3 has happened. And other countries are also aligning strategies to help from an overall tax and customs and trade perspective. What has come out of that now is companies have determined that it is okay and appropriate to then make some changes to their operating models because they know that the tariffs are probably not going away. Even what happens in the Supreme Court case we can talk about in a little bit. Even if they go away temporarily, they're not going away long term. So they have to plan for tariff impacts not only now, but for this administration and potentially the next administration forward, regardless of which party wins the next election. And the reason being, let's think back what happened in the Biden administration. How many of those tariffs that Trump had in Trump 1.0 were unwound? 0.
Right.
In fact, Biden added some tariffs.
Right. He piled on.
So companies are realizing these tariffs are probably not going away. I need to do something now because I need to make sure that I'm managing my margin and how we're going to operate differently. And so that's what companies are doing is they're making changes that are kind of no regret planning to the operating model. And I can go into those if you like.
Well,
or
let's
where
come
you wanna
back
go.
to that because I do want to maybe start because everybody's talking about the Supreme Court case. But let me just throw out a little bit of data for folks. And I think this goes to the point insofar as why future administrations may not be able to pull back from that. So there was recently some data provided by, I think it was the Government Budget Office, a record 195 billion in net customs receipts currently for the fiscal year. So I think that might have been through September. And that's an increase of 118 billion from the prior year. So it was 200%, increase.
Right.
And that has helped with the deficit, right? The U.S. has, obviously huge deficit issues, and that is one of the reasons, if not, that is one of the reasons I think that future administrations, it will be hard. Once you start adding to those coffers, it's going to be hard to pull back from that given the current U.S. fiscal scenario. All right, so let's start, because this is at the top, everybody's asking about the Supreme Court case, which is related to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
IEEPA.
And the case, which is a consolidated case, is Learning Resources versus Trump and Trump versus VOS selections, but I don't really hear anybody actually using the name. It's just the Tariff Supreme Court case. So maybe provide a little bit of background and context and what can we expect here in the next few weeks.
So what's interesting about the IEEPA tariffs that happened this year compared to what happened in Trump 1.0. 1.0, we had investigations where there's many different mechanisms for tariffs. They have the Section 301, Section 232. Section 301 is when we feel like there's unfair trade practices. And we felt as though there was unfair trade practices with China. They had an investigation. They found, yes, they were unfair. Then we had the 301 tariffs. Those have teeth after the investigation.
And those are specific powers that Congress has granted the executive branch and the presidency to administer as a response to unfair trade practices.
Yeah, and that one has to go through an investigation for USTR. And they had to do a full investigation, report back, and then if the findings were yes, they were unfair trade practices, then the president had authority to then.
So there's a condition before those tariffs can be imposed.
Yeah, and the same thing with the 232s that we're hearing about, that those investigations have been happening in the background, and those when we feel like there's a threat to national security from the importation of products into the United States, which talks about different things from the fentanyl to other things that deal with impacting the trade deficits and various other factors when we think about trade relations. And so these have been going on, but they take time. So what the president decided to do is...
Does that include the steel and aluminum?
Steel and aluminum, yeah.
Are also the 232s?
Yeah. So there's different aspects of the 232s that have happened over the past. So we did have the 232s in Trump 1.0. Now we have additional 232s, but they always are getting tweaked based upon that investigation. Because the president wanted to operate very quickly, said, why don't we do something different? Let's impose IEEPA, skip the investigations, and I say it's a national emergency, and I'm going to issue tariffs. And that's what would happen. That's what happened for Liberation Day. Tariffs went into play as early as actually March of this year. They were announced in February. They had about a 30-day delay. So we did have some of those IEEPA tariffs come into February. And then the predominant ones came later on in the year for the reciprocal and other tariffs later on in the summer. Now, what happened is that this went through the courts because they said, hey, listen, is that a power the president can have to impose a national state of emergency and then automatically turn into, I can now tariff you? That cause and effect is really what's at question.
Yeah,
for
because Congress allows the president, when there's a national emergency, to be able to institute these tariffs. And the question is that, there's a much more technical, but is Trump using the powers that were afforded him by Congress? And that's what the Supreme Court's going to decide.
That's right. In fact, it was surprising to a lot of us from a customs perspective, and even when we're talking with our U.S. policy folks, is that they asked to accelerate this to the Supreme Court and say, we want you to make a decision on this in an expedited ruling, which that's what we're going to be having. We're going to have that coming up in November, an expedited ruling related to the legality of the IEEPA tariffs. And what we did is, now that this is going to be happening, what are the possible outcomes of this? They can be found to be legal and they stay as is. They could be found to be illegal and they would have to be potentially refunded back, or somewhere in between.
And it's like, is it like 80 billion or it's a big number?
Well,
right?
It's bigger than that. So we actually, we're publishing an insight. You love insights, right?
I do.
So we're publishing an insight. So what we've done is we've taken a lot of the government numbers, the CBP numbers, and what they've collected for IEEPA. And then we said, what does that look like up and through the end of October, to say how much from February to October is at stake? We've got about 108 billion is what we're estimating. Wow. Okay. 108 billion spread across different types of IEEPA tariffs, but also different industries. I mean, it's going from our technology industries, about 32 billion of that, industrial products, about 29 billion, consumer products, about 14 billion. These are huge amounts of money. The question becomes, what if they are found illegal, which people do believe it's a coin flip? How are they going to get that money back? Because if there's $108 billion of all of a sudden to be refunded back to companies, companies are going to want to get that as quickly as possible. CFOs, CEOs saying, hey, I've got a receivable I never had before, and it's X amount of $1 million. I want to expedite that. It's going to be tough.
And by the way, while we're recording this, the U.S. government is currently shut down, with some speculation that this could last another month or so. So that could also add some challenges to trying to.
Do we need people to do this, Doug? Is that how this works?
Well, maybe AI can refund everybody their money.
We can write an agent for this. Right. This is perfect.
But that would be a huge, from just a splash to the economy. Just if all that money were to be injected back into the economy. Is there an in-between, though? You mentioned sort of the Trump administration wins, the Trump administration loses. Is there someplace in
Absolutely. They could also find that certain, we have the reciprocal tariffs by themselves. It's about 63 billion of the 108. But then we have the China-Hong Kong, that's about 34. Mexico, 6.2. So what they might be doing is they might sliver off some things, say, we believe this is appropriate for these particular jurisdictions or these types of tariffs, but not these. So then if that's the case, it's then only the imports that are involved in those situations would be at issue. So I know that this is a tax podcast too, and I know we're bringing in trade and tariffs, which is a tax, but we also have to think about what does this mean from an international tax and transfer pricing lens, because a lot of companies have performed modifications to transfer pricing based upon tariffs, because all of a sudden we have a new cost of goods sold that's coming in on importation. There's going to have to be some connectivity related to, if this does happen, what are you going to do about that? So, are you going to make adjustments to your policy? Is it a temporary adjustment? Because, what we were talking about earlier with the 232 investigations, The IEEPA might be found to be, call it illegal and not allowed, but then they're going to turn the switch on for the 232s, and the tariffs will continue on. So you might just have a gap, a tariff gap of 108 billion per se, but then they're going to go back on. It's going to be a lot of complexities for taxpayers, for how that's going to be retrieved. But then the follow-up to that, Doug, is let's say a company, consumer markets company, gets $10 billion of their tariffs back, and they've charged their customers for that. Are the customers going to see any of that back too, or how's that going to work? It's going to be a lot of stuff going on.
Oh yeah, and from a PR perspective, I mean, just a lot of challenges. And of course, there's been a lot of companies that have come out and said that they've been eating the cost of the tariffs versus pushing some of those on. I think that's to your point on certainty. As the environment becomes more certain, and particularly after these tariffs, I think we could see companies maybe push more of those prices onto the consumers if they haven't. I mean, all very good questions. One thing that I have seen over the course of the last 9 months since the Trump administration has come in and really have been wielding their tariff powers is the folks at large companies, those people that are responsible for tariffs, have obviously been elevated now,
yes.
Right? Like, I mean, now, talking directly to CFOs and, really have elevated their status given all of this uncertainty and the potential issue with the bottom line. What I've also seen is those tariff team members working very closely with tax. And then sometimes maybe they were sitting outside the tax department, maybe now they're part of the tax department. But to your point, that like from a transfer pricing perspective, to the extent that companies are thinking about changing some of their supply chains, there's obviously direct taxes involved. It really calls the need for the folks that are doing trade and tariffs and the folks that are doing direct taxes and even indirect taxes all really need to be working together more than they have historically.
More than ever in my career, the customs team, who has historically been compliance oriented, take care of compliance, that's pretty much it. They have now been elevated to pretty much has an open spot in the calendar of the CEO, CFO on a quarterly, monthly basis to report out what the impact is, what are our options, and these are conversations that are uncomfortable for a lot of the folks that are in that industry. And so that's where, to your point, there's a need to get great advisors, but combined with that is making sure you have the internal team to help you out, to look at the cause and effect of any one thing from a customs and duty perspective. What's the impact for transfer pricing, international tax, supply chain, logistics? That team needs to be together to help present any of the what ifs, any of the solutioning. Because if you don't, you're siloed solutioning, and that's going to have maybe an upside one place, but you don't know what that benefit erosion is going to be in another, and that's going to look really bad when you report that out.
Yeah, absolutely. This is multi-dimensional chess. And then, of course, now with tax, we have to deal with Pillar 2 beyond just the direct taxes. And so all of these need to be layered on top of each other as companies are thinking about changing some of their business models. So let's move into that now. Specifically, what are companies doing to manage these issues?
So there's lots of different things that companies are doing that are more like no regret planning that we deal with even on the tax side, but now we're getting into some customs planning. There's been different types of strategies that have been around for 40, 50 years, some over 200 years. And one of them that's been around for 40 years has been first sale for export. That's been around primarily in the retail space. That has been because consumer products have always had a high tariff rate. And that allows you to go one step back in the supply chain of what your kind of contractor toll manufacturer sells to the middleman, which is pre-import, and then they sell to the US company. You're able to use the toll manufacturer price to the middleman as the price you're able to declare upon importation in the United States. Some potentially big savings, 10 to 30, 40% perhaps on the tariff rate. But these structures, though, they're going to be highly scrutinized. Customs doesn't like these structures. They are very, they come out there and say these are not structures they like, but it's a statute, so they have to abide by it. So they're going to go through and try to find ways to say your structure's inappropriate or not done properly, dismiss the structure, which could have up to a 5-year look back. So that's the doom part of it. But the opportunity is, but if you do it right, and you're having this, you then have a perpetual savings on a go forward for that supply chain. So companies are rushing to either modify or bring in a first sale for export strategy that allows them to take advantage of a reduction of those tariffs for certain supply chains or certain countries. But you need to be careful with these because they are going to be audited. And you can't just put it in and say, we're good. You have to make sure it's done properly with the right guidance along the way, but also to make sure you have the right controls going forward, because there's a lot of dynamics that are involved with that, including leverage into transfer pricing and arm's length studies that are part of some of the analysis you look at for arm's length pricing for one of the transaction flows.
And how does that work for the first sale? Can that be done with if a third party is manufacturing? It doesn't have to be a related party, right?
It doesn't.
Doing the manufacturing.
But then
the original that source of manufacturing.
100% right. But then you have more complexity sometimes, because then they get into, well, we don't want to get into our profits and what that relates to and how much that is. So we have to find a way to allow for that to be disclosed properly for first sale, but also maybe the parties that are involved not knowing the actual pricing or profits that are involved in the supply chain for those pieces. So it brings another layer of complexity, but can it be done? Absolutely. Companies do that all the time. In fact, the high-end retailers, that is their supply chain. That's what they've had to do. We just have a lot of intercompany transactions, because when we look at census and trade data, like nearly 50% of the imports are intercompany in the United States. So you want to go to the next one?
Across industries.
Yeah, across industries, yeah. So the next one's duty drawback. That's been around for, call it, a couple hundred years, and that's where you imagine import and export, but it's not available for all tariffs. Like some portion of the IEEPAs, it's not available, but for the 301s and some of the IEEPAs, you can use duty drawback. Basically, you're matching an import to an export over a 5-year period, and when you're able to do that, you can get up to 99% back on the import price paid for the tariff. But it is a data model intensive exercise. Again, you have to have the right supporting documentation, and there's a lot of efficiencies that you need to do to make sure you're getting the maximum ROI on the matching.
So the companies that would be potentially eligible for the duty drawback are those that are importing, whether it's finished goods or even raw materials, and then those that are doing some form of exportation. It doesn't need to be of those same goods, right? There's no tracing.
That's right. And you have the complication where you need to have the export after the import, and you need to make sure there's enough date range to allow for price matching, to allow how much of that 99% can you get back on the import price. So a lot of companies with the tariffs that we're talking about today in 2025, they're probably not using those yet in a duty drawback program unless they have another type of program for direct ID. So this is where it's going to be on hold a little bit, and probably is good in case there's a refund opportunity under some of those IEEPAs. The next area is getting into classification, because there's a lot of industries, like 2/3 of the industries did not pay tariffs. And the classification of the goods in the United States, they sometimes would put them under a general category versus specific. And those general categories now are perhaps the ones getting tariffed under the new tariff regime. But if you can change it to a subcategory that might be more detailed, you can actually perhaps lower the tariff, or you can get out of the tariff if it's zero tariffed. Or you might do an analysis in the country of origin really wasn't proper, and it was a different country of origin. All of these things provide significant mitigation if you're able to change things up in an environment a company may have where they were zero tariff before, now they're being tariffed. Let's go through and do an analysis to make sure if we're going to be tariffed, it is right.
And that makes sense. Like historically, companies maybe just weren't paying as much attention because none of it was subject to tariffs. Now that certain steel and aluminum or whatever are, can you look a little bit more precisely to determine exactly how those are characterized for customs purposes?
That's right. And then I would say the last big area is working with just transfer pricing, because in transfer pricing, a lot of 50% of the imports being intercompany, companies can modify intercompany pricing within an arm's length range. Well, why wouldn't you modify it to be maybe at a point in the range that allows you to have a lower import price? I mean, why wouldn't you think that would be appropriate? Well, perhaps it is, but then what does that mean for customs purposes? And the big thing, Doug, is this year, which is going to be a very challenging year, not only for the customs folks, but for transfer pricing international tax, is what if there's those changes with the IEEPAs? What if there's large end-of-the-year adjustments that are made for transfer pricing? These groups need to get together to make sure they're doing the right thing for tax, transfer pricing, and customs. The numbers are too big to have a miss on whether or not you properly have done the adjustment to also say, should there be a correlating adjustment on the import side for customs?
So I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I want you to explain it to listeners. Is appropriate arm's length transfer price for tax purposes a good arm's length price for customs purposes?
Maybe. Can be.
Yeah.
They look at things differently.
Exactly. So talk a little bit about that, because that's one of the things that I've learned working with you guys over the course of the last 9 months is kind of that difference between the tax mindset of transfer pricing versus the customs mindset of transfer pricing.
Yeah, I'm going to put the two hats on because I started off with the transfer pricing hat for most of my career. Now it's customs, but they do overlap, and sometimes they can be used together to corroborate the results. So transfer pricing, we look at comparables and generally overall profitability. Is the entity profitable, or we look at a cost plus markup or operating profit margin using 3 years of comps and saying if the functions, the risks and intangibles for those comparables make sense, then these transactions for a particular 1 year or 3 year period are arm's length. Customs says, good for you, that's great, but we want to look at the product. We want to look at transactional based by transaction to say, is that transaction arm's length for customs purposes? And they don't look at the general overall profitability. They want to look at product comparability if possible, exact product, similar product, and go transaction by transaction. And they're focused on the cost of goods sold elements, not necessarily the SG&A pieces. So it's kind of apples and oranges when you do the comparison, even though they're arm's length or they're supposed to have an arm's length nature to them. But there are attributes for the different methodologies that can be overlapped, which that's where, to me, best practice advice is having teams that can articulate and bridge the gap of your transfer pricing arm's length policy to what customs valuation has and talk about where they're different, but where they overlap. That's a winning structure to me.
Makes sense. Maybe I'll add one more to managing the issues that we've seen. I mean, this goes back to the customs days, is just looking at your overall supply chain, figuring out what those flow of goods are between countries, and are there alternatives between who you're sourcing for what particular markets, and particularly in industrial products, for example, even some of the retail and consumer products. Looking to determine, well, should X country, instead of servicing the U.S., they can be sourcing for Y country, and then you can have Z country sourcing for the U.S. Obviously, those are big operational changes, but we certainly saw a lot of companies do that during COVID, right? Just sort of the nearshoring, just strategically looking at supply chain to come up with a better economic result. Layering tariffs into that part of the analysis, I've seen also be successful for some large companies.
I think that's a great point. The challenge is that there's still so much uncertainty to move your supply chain to a location that doesn't have a trade agreement that's been executed brings potential additional risk to you.
And this is another great point. And I'm not suggesting that companies are just propping up manufacturing locations, right? Because that is one thing where we talk about bringing a lot of manufacturing jobs to the U.S. or manufacturing to the U.S. That's going to take years to build the plant. And where I've seen where companies already have a diversification of maybe different geographies where they may be doing the manufacturing, looking at alternative routes, for example, of where they may do that supply. But that does have significant business implications and costs, and those companies are those tend to be longer term or midterm decisions, and companies want certainty before they're going to make changes to their business models.
If a company has the ability to look at all the places they source from, related and unrelated, and are able to quickly pivot and actually just buy from another location and already know that tariff rate today, absolutely they're doing that. But when they actually have an integrated operations of their supply chain, related party manufacturers that they're going to then want to set up another one, that's where the calculus has been a little bit more difficult because you don't have some of the certainty. And the question becomes, well, if I know that the runway is going to be maybe 3 to 5 to 8 years longer, at least with tariffs that we know of, what is that worth for us to make an investment into the U.S. or make a pledge of an investment which might lower tariffs today, depending upon how much it is, which is another piece of number one questions we get is, how much do we need to pledge so that we can get out of tariffs now? I mean, that is a definite viable piece that maybe there'll be clarification at some point. But that combined with actually then shovels in the ground to then what that can look like to what's the impact can be very impactful. But there's also other strategies that companies are imposing with foreign trade zones too, where, hey, you can bring your goods into the United States, and if you keep it in a foreign trade zone, manufacture and export out, you actually get zero tariffed. So it's just
that still works.
Yeah, and that still works too. So it's just like every operating business model, you have to dissect it in a way that maybe you didn't before.
So you mentioned audits, and I know there was a Department of Justice memo that came out as we're talking about, companies looking at, ways to potentially mitigate those. Maybe talk a little bit about what did that memo say, and you mentioned the audits. What can companies do to try to manage that risk?
This is the thing that does keep me up at night, is that all the different solutioning that companies are doing now, there is so much pressure to mitigate things as quickly as possible. The run rate of tariff amounts per month and what can be saved with some of these strategies are more than millions, sometimes tens of millions, and over time, in some companies, in a year, it could be $1 billion. This is above line cash. These strategies are being put in place, and the Department of Justice issued the memo that you mentioned, and they talked about how there's going to be an increase in white-collar crimes, and trade and tariffs and customs, number 2 on that list. That's a top spot.
Yeah.
And what that means is structures and transactions are going to be heavily audited in the future. And it's not just from CBP. It's going to have a multifaceted approach, which also can include tax, Department of Justice. And they even talked about a special task force that they are going to put together in August related to auditing different types of transactions. So as a company, when I'm viewing this information about the Department of Justice and what I'm going to try to mitigate myself in my operating model, I want to be thoughtful of whatever I'm putting together here, I'm going to be audited in the future. And when this group audits me, I have the right supporting documentation to defend what I believe we did right.
And you had mentioned CBP a couple of times. That's Customs and Border Patrol, and they're the ones that have jurisdiction over tariffs and auditing these.
Yep,
these tariffs.
that's the group that we do all the work for. That's where you file your drawback claims. Those are the ones that do the customs audits. So, yep.
There was some discussion at the beginning of the Trump administration that there might be a new department.
I knew you were going to go there.
But
you're going to bring this up.
We're not. But we still have the CBP at this point.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can leave it at that.
We can bring that back up if you want.
So maybe sort of towards the end here, there's a lot of very specific industry tariffs that we're seeing. Obviously, a lot of discussions from pharma, an auto. I've been interested in that. The Trump administration recently issued some new duties on kitchen cabinets and vanities October 1st. I'm going to list a couple specific ones. Tariffs on timber and certain wood products that take effect October 14th. Large trucks to take effect November 1st. And then there was some proposed legislation, because coffee is also one of the things that are potentially subject, and nobody wants to pay more money for their coffee, right? And then there was it's called the proposed No Coffee Tax Act that was proposed in September. That was actually a bipartisan legislation, which we don't get very often in the U.S. Is that a trend now, these industry specifics? Is that a reaction to IEEPA? Maybe if you could shed some light on that. And then where is this going? Is this all going to end up on just very specific industry sector, even product specific, and lobbying to try to manage tariffs on particular sectors or products?
Great question. And it's really hard for companies, practitioners to stay afloat and keep up with all the changes. Very, very difficult. I think that some of the most difficult jobs right now are the poor forwarders and brokers that are trying to collect properly at the border. Oh my word. They just are inundated with questions, and they don't even know what's the decision tree of what this is based upon when it was shipped and when it is imported and what's today, what's the tariff today,
and is it law? Is this just a proposal? Yeah. Is it actually law?
And what we've seen, the trend that we've seen is that there are large groups of tariffs, big numbers applied, and then there's usually some scaling back. Maybe a scaling back of a rate, or reparceling out products from an HTS classification perspective, so that it then is really ultimately what we're finding the administration wanted in the first place. But they usually go big, and then they scale back, maybe overall rates or by products and industries. What we've been hearing about is the pharma pharmaceutical tariffs combined with the semiconductor tariffs for a while now. In fact, we heard that they were going to come out in August and then September, but there's been so much lobbying by the companies in those groups to say, hey, we gotta work something out, because we've heard rumors of 200%, 50%, a scaled rate over the next 2 years. We still don't know yet, but they are coming.
And a number of big companies in both of those industries, both semiconductors and pharmaceutical, have announced massive investments for manufacturing in the U.S. as well.
That's right. And those investments are meant to hopefully postpone or lighten what the initial thoughts would be by the administration of what they talked about, but there's still uncertainty. And so that goes back to some of the planning, like a lot of the structures are being done. It's the pharma companies, it's the semiconductor companies are saying, we got to put stuff in place now, because when things do roll out for those specific ones, we want to make sure we take advantage of that for some of those mitigation opportunities. But at the same time, it's really tough to plan for all the nuances that you just mentioned. You rattled off a list about coffee and lumber, and those are like one-off things. How do you plan for that? Those are not, but somehow the administration finds out information about a certain piece, and then they said, okay, we're going to now institute this. Those are the one-off statements that are really hard to plan for. But companies, I think what it comes down to, Doug, is they have to have a firm grasp of their data and their operating model when it comes to the product categories and how they're classified, so that when you hear an announcement or you hear a true social, you're able to quickly say, okay, customs team, logistics team, what does it mean for us? We got the data already. We know we do. What's the number today? What does it look like? And what are our options? That's where you want to be.
I love it. And so maybe sort of as the last question here in conclusion, you mentioned companies really need to understand their data and operating models. What advice do you have for those companies out there that are struggling with all of the uncertainty? I mean, you already are articulated, but maybe specific to some of the data and operating model, maybe what advice do you have for listeners?
Well, your data is already there. It depends on how you have it in your ERP systems. U.S. Customs has their own database of your own data too that you have access to that you can utilize. I'd bring those together. We talked about that before, the U.S. Customs ACE database. If you're able to do that and have it by product, by HTS code, you're able to then understand the exact tariff rates. Now, one of the things that we're going to have in the insight that I mentioned in IEEPA, one of the things that companies should do today is like, hey, how much of our products have been subject to IEEPA? What does that number look like? What are the different entries we have since February? And if I needed to do a refund process, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing goes with modeling out new impacts. With, hey, we imported coffee last year. Well, what's that impact from this jurisdiction versus another? Having that data on a model that is dynamic is super important. And I know we say that a lot, but this is real dollars. These are real dollars related to the impact of what you specifically import by HTS classification. So if you don't have a grasp of that, and if it's vague grasp, you have vague numbers and vague planning. You need to have precise planning, because if you're going to make an action to modify something, you want to make sure you're modifying something you're confident in the data.
I love it. We're going to leave it there. Chris, always great to have you on. Maybe we'll get you in the spring and we can prognosticate about the Cardinals and the Cubs.
I love it.
I'm not overly optimistic.
Can we do this from spring training? Can we head out there?
Well, I'll be there. I take my mom down there every year.
Can I go with you and your mom?
Yeah, absolutely. Come down and join us. She would love the company, and as would I, frankly. So, Chris, thank you very much for coming on. Always great insights, and I always learned something on the trade and customs. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Chris Desmond, PwC's U.S. Global Trade Services Leader. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of the Cross Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.